Hello, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. You should have a little hands up button on your console. So if you can press the hands up button if you can hear me, that would be great. Just so I know I'm not speaking into the ether. Brilliant. There are some hands up. Good. We are expecting quite a few more people, so I'll just wait for a couple of minutes. I'll just keep you on hold before we make a start, if that's okay. And I will just mute myself. So we just have the kind of plain screen, but I haven't gone away. Just wait for a couple of minutes.
It could be nice weather up there.
Hello to new joiners. We're just waiting for more people to log on before we kick off with the webinar. So do just hold on. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on the consequences of Brexit, an update and what we do next. So my name is Tony Armstrong. I'm Chief Executive of Locality. So some of you were here just when I did a quick sound check, but if you can press your hands up button, if you can hear me, just so I can check. Great. I shouldn't do it the other way around and say hands up if you can't hear me, of course, because then you can't. So I'll assume that people not putting their hands up are okay. There is an easy way. This isn't the most interactive of forums, unfortunately, but it's quite an efficient way of just getting information out. The way we can do interaction is if you just put in any comments in the chat or questions box. It may come out differently, but it's either the chat or the questions, whichever one is showing, and you can type in there and then I can see whatever you're typing. And it's quite nice because this is a bit like a radio broadcast, or if you're a little bit more modern, like a kind of YouTube vlogging kind of thing. So it's good to get feedback to check that I'm not just kind of talking to nobody. So if you do want to kind of say anything, then any comments gratefully welcome, just to say hello or just to say have any questions or things that you want to input. Just jot them down in that box and I will be able to see them. So it kind of creates a little bit of interactivity. And if you've got anything you want to share with the rest of the group or questions that you ask, just put them in there and I shall read them out, unless you don't. So I've got a bit of a presentation, just a couple of slides really just to kind of set the scene around our thoughts around the consequences since the referendum and what we're planning to do. So I will share those statistics, those slides with you, so you can see what we are talking about, and then you'll kind of see me again interspersed with the presentation slides. So I'm just going to touch base on that. Okay, so lots and lots of things have happened, obviously, since the referendum. So this is obviously quite a big decision that the country has taken. What we're not going to do here today is try and rehearse the arguments that led up to the referendum decision. But what we want to focus on is our reaction, what we do as an organisation across our members, and what are the things that have affected our member organisations. So since June, there have been lots of opportunities to talk to our members, community anchor organisations around the country at regional meetings and events. I've been to a couple of those. Been some very lively conversations that have happened about the consequences, people's hopes, and the opportunities and threats that come from how Brexit unfolds. So what we plan to do is really continue these conversations, and we thought it was useful to get people together who were interested to kind of hear about what we've been doing and then help us plan for the future. So as I said, it's not particularly interactive, but do feed in any of those comments as we go. So what we know, so Theresa May is very fond of saying Brexit means Brexit, which obviously is utterly meaningless on one level, but it's a kind of, it might be on her political epitaph because it's a thing so associated with her. The things we've managed to find out, or that are fairly clear from the government's priorities, are that Article 50 will be triggered no later than March 2017. That's a fairly specific commitment that's been made by the government. And then that will trigger a 2-year process, which is formalised in the Lisbon Treaty, which would see, if that timetable works out, that the UK would exit the EU by summer 2019. Now, what exactly it means in terms of the UK exiting the EU, I guess, will be determined by some of the negotiations. So we may stay in parts of the structures of the EU, we may leave parts of them, and again, that will all become clear over the coming months. There is really, really limited detail on the terms. Partly that's entirely understandable. This is a negotiation, so we're not going to have that set out in real time with every twist and turn. The government has said, and there's a controversy this week, that there isn't going to be a parliamentary vote. But what we can see from all of the clues are that the government seems to be signalling a preference for what has become known as hard Brexit. So essentially prioritising controls over immigration, controls over the free movement of people, over accessing and membership of the single market. That seems to be a pretty clear trade-off, and it seems to be pretty clear that government is going down there restricting free movements rather than prioritising single market access. I think, reading between the lines, it's clear that there is hope that a negotiation will give us the best of all worlds, but clearly that's going to require some nimble negotiating footwork, so it remains to be seen whether that's working. Key emerging issues. Firstly, immigration. So restricting free movements does have quite significant implications in terms of our immigration policy as a country. We know that the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, was talking at the Conservative Party conference about employers having to list all their foreign-born employees. It was quite interesting how quickly that was backtracked on. It's no longer a published list, but it is about monitoring. So we shall be watching that very carefully about what they want to suggest they do. But I think the signal that's sent out across the world has been slightly damaging around restricting kind of highly skilled migration. On the economy, if we are looking at some of the statements, we'd think austerity was over. So happy days for everybody. We all realise that austerity is over. I suspect we're not going to feel quite that happy when we see the autumn statement, but the new Chancellor Philip Hammond has suggested that the autumn statement, which is going to be at the end of November, will reset the economy. And there's likely to be, from what we hear from talking to civil servants, some quite large funding announcements on infrastructure, etc. The trick is, and the thing that we're trying to influence, is around getting that new spending to be on things which we think will benefit communities in a short period of time, rather than the kind of very, very long-term transport infrastructure type of agenda. We know that Theresa May has also focused on her conference speech to say that government can and should be a force for good. The state exists to provide what individual people, communities and markets cannot. So there is a very different mood music, at least, coming from the government. So again, remain to be seen. EU funding is one of the things that members so far have said to us is one of the major things they're concerned about. There has been some clarity that the EU structural and investment funds signed off before this coming November, so in the next few weeks, as well as Horizon 2020 funding that has been previously announced, that will be protected by the Treasury. So that includes everything that will be signed off by the autumn statement, but clearly it doesn't guarantee anything that may be secured or bidded for post-November, even though we are still members of the EU, obviously, until we're not. There's a big degree of uncertainty about how much we'll be able to access the money that's floating around over the next 2 years. There hasn't been a quid pro quo in terms of the EU not wanting the UK's contributions of income, so I imagine there'll be further conversations to be had about what we can do to access any of that EU funding. And we have been working across with other sector organisations, partner organisations, for urgent clarity. So we've written a joint letter to the Treasury asking for greater clarity on all of that funding. One of the things that has been very clear, not necessarily an EU-related development, but clearly it's completely as a result of the referendum, is that we've got a new Prime Minister, we have new ministers and a new agenda across government. So Theresa May, outside number 10, when she suddenly became Prime Minister, gave a speech where you think, if you take it at face value, there were lots of opportunities for our agenda there. So she talked about her ambition to tackle burning injustices, and there's a couple of quotes there you can see on the screen, talking a lot about her government working not for the interests of the privileged few, and she quite interestingly co-opted the Brexit kind of campaign slogan about having more control, taking back control. So the early developments in terms of fleshing this out have not been entirely positive in terms of that agenda seeping through all aspects of government policy, as you may expect. There has been movement, though. There's on this kind of social mobility agenda, they're using that kind of language in government, and they're using the language of creating an inclusive economy. There is a new cross-government committee on social reform. We've been working again with our partner organisations across the sector, so kind of charity, social enterprise, umbrella bodies. We work together through a thing called the Social Economy Alliance, which brings together all of those bodies, who will share an interest in creating a social economy that works better for society. And we've been inputting together into number 10's policy unit's work on defining what an inclusive economy may look like. At their request, they've been looking specifically at 3 broad areas: opportunities for young people, housing, and tackling the poverty premium, which, if you're not familiar with the jargon, it's essentially why people on low incomes tend to have to pay more for basic services through things like metered electricity, etc. So we've been feeding in some ideas, some of the experiences of members into those broad areas. We've been doing a lot of work on community-led housing in particular, so that's a really important one for us, and we're hopeful that there are going to be some big funding announcements on community-led housing coming up, although we obviously have to wait to see what the Chancellor says. We've also been pushing for a broader agenda than just those three areas, important though they are. So we've been emphasising common ownership of assets, which is a thing that you'd expect us to talk about, making sure devolution and the devolution agenda really transfers powers down to a local level, and that the economic growth agenda that's really being pushed because of the concerns about the economic impact of Brexit, that they focus on social economy issues and focus on neighbourhoods and communities as well. Do, by the way, feel free to pass on any questions and type into the box there, or any issues that you want me to focus on or talk about a little bit more as I go through. So next slide, talking about our priorities. So clearly there's a lot of uncertainty around this agenda, and we're unable to give you all of the answers because I don't think even the government knows exactly how this is going to pan out. What we know is that it's going to impact on funding, it's going to impact on the economy. There are going to be consequences, there already have been consequences for community cohesion and the impact on migrants, communities. And they're the things that have come up from our early consultations and conversations with our members. So it'd be interesting to see whether those are the things that you think are the major issues, and whether there's anything else that we need to be focusing on. So we know that politicians and commentators have talked a lot about the left behind communities which have not benefited from economic growth and feel disenfranchised and disconnected. And there's a lot of talk, as you will have picked up, about divisions being exposed between different people in different parts of the country, the north versus the south, London versus everybody else, Scotland versus England, older people versus younger people, etc., etc. And I think for us across our network of members, lots of the, lots of the things that have been exposed are not exactly a surprise to us. We've known that lots of communities have not benefited from economic growth for many decades. We know that there are huge disadvantages for lots of people who live in some of the most challenged areas. We know there are community cohesion tensions. I guess what the referendum has done has exposed some of those and given more attention to it. But also lots of people are projecting the reasons for why people have voted in a certain way. And I think it's quite lazy, some of that analysis, and quite shallow, some of those observations. But we've got to kind of draw a line under that kind of debate, I guess, because it's a bit self-defeating and doesn't really take us anywhere. What we've been trying to focus on is, if Brexit does mean Brexit, well, how will that unfold? And what should we be doing to kind of make it happen in a way that's advantageous for our members? The fact that there is a tension on those divisions is potentially an opportunity for us, because people are talking about disadvantage in a way that they weren't doing 6 months ago. So we've got to try and use that, because there is going to be enormous change, and with any change comes opportunity. So I think we've got to try and see that there is a renewed focus on an inclusive economy, and it's good that that phrase is being used, but we need to flesh it out in terms of what it means for people. So our sector is definitely part of that solution to many of the challenges our country now faces. And we want to be working with partners to create a positive vision of what that means, reimagine the way in which the economy works. Globalisation has not worked for lots of communities, so we're starting to think about, with globalisation comes localisation. Our Keep It Local campaign is all about how the myth of economies of scale means that you're not retaining wealth within local areas. We're doing a lot of work around that. So we've got some potentially good answers to some of these things, and what we want to be doing is feeding in really clear ideas, policy proposals, and some of the risks around how this unfolds as well. We've been looking specifically at 3 broad areas for some of that influencing work and some of the activity that we at Locality want to be doing on behalf of our members. So the 3 areas are Community cohesion, integration, migration, race equality. Again, that's the thing that people have been most concerned about in terms of the short term. Community engagement, involvement and accountability, which I think is a broad area, something a lot of our members are doing a lot of things on. Some of our members perhaps aren't doing a lot of things on actually because community development budgets have been cut. Community organising programme was great whilst it lasted, but that has now come to an end. And this kind of feeling of people being in control of what they do is one of those big issues in this kind of area. And then that economic argument, so the left behind communities that haven't felt economic growth. And it was very interesting at one of the events that we had for our members trustees, so most of the people at the event, it was a kind of a Yorkshire-based event, and most of the attendees were resident board members of our member organisations. And actually there were quite a few people who were saying, you know, there may have been a lot of EU funding that was coming into this broad area, but my town hasn't really seen the benefit, it hasn't really improved. So there's lots of clear feelings that it's not just about replicating what has been going on, it's about seeking new ways of supporting communities. So there's some of the things that we've been thinking. So it'd be really great to have any views you may have. We've been surveying our members over the last month, and there's a survey being circulated on our member email distribution list to try and give us a bit of a steer in terms of identifying what the key issues are for our members and the communities that they serve. So we want to build a profile of how the community sector is responding during this period of uncertainty, and then gather inspirational stories of what community anchor organisations are doing to unite their neighbourhoods, because we need to inject a bit of positive, okay, let's think about the opportunities in this, whatever anybody voted, lots of stuff is changing and let's make it sure it changes for the best. So we will send around the link to make sure that you can take part in that survey. But it would be really great if people are happy to share any initial thoughts. If you can, just type them in the text box around these questions. So as you can see, the first slide there is, how do you feel about the future for your community post-EU referendum? And we've been asking people on the survey to tell us broadly optimistic, pessimistic or neither, but obviously beyond that we'd like to have specifics in terms of what people are feeling. So it'd be great if you could contribute your thoughts on the text box to that. Whilst you're hopefully doing that, I mean, it was interesting that some of the initial activity and concerns that have come out from members haven't been entirely predictable. So people are concerned about community cohesion, as I mentioned, but one of our members was talking to us a couple of weeks ago and saying actually they have a big problem in that the nursery that they operate, and they operate it at a healthy surplus. It's been generally something that's a really reliable source of income. They haven't had to worry too much. Suddenly it's become very, very shaky financially because a large number of Polish families who lived in the areas took their kids out of nursery because they were concerned about bullying, antisocial behaviour. A lot of people went back to Poland, at least for the summer, just to kind of get away from the very toxic view, and they were feeling very scared about stuff. So obviously that's very poor in terms of community cohesion, but actually had a direct and short-term impact on our members' finances because their business model was suddenly undercut by something which was relatively unpredictable. So stories like that are really important. We've got somebody commenting saying, feeling fairly optimistic about the future for your community post-EU referendum. Do most people feel optimistic? If you want to just kind of jot down whether you feel optimistic or whether you feel pessimistic or neither, and if you've got any other nuggets of information. I think there's a couple of people feeling optimistic, a couple of people feeling pessimistic. There's a question, do we have a communities champion within government, and would it help if we did? It's an interesting question, actually. We have, we have a minister for communities. I wouldn't exactly call the minister a champion for communities. We find it quite difficult, as lots of other sector bodies do, I think, to find a spark of interest, I guess, from ministers and civil servants in this whole agenda. And that's been the case, actually, in absolute truth, since the coalition government ended. When, whatever anybody thinks about the Liberal Democrats, they did have a different approach, actually, in government. And when the Tories got a majority government, and I'm not making a political party point here, but there was suddenly a lack of interest in kind of thinking about some solutions for whatever reason. There was a very, very clear focus on manifesto commitments and manifesto commitments only. Since the referendum, I think one of the really big consequences, which perhaps wasn't really thought through, was civil servants are now entirely occupied with questions about Brexit. So finding space to even have a kind of open conversation with them about positive things is more difficult than it was, and that's certainly true. And there wasn't a large amount of planning in government departments for a leave vote that was kind of sanctioned from the top of government, and it's absolutely true that that planning has not happened. You know, we've talked to lots and lots of civil servants over the last few months, and they're now starting from scratch. They started from scratch in terms of planning. So that kind of opportunity cost, I guess, in terms of people's attention, was very difficult. So a couple of other people have just said neither optimistic, pessimistic. So a bit of a range of views. So just thinking about the next question, the other thing we've been asking, has your organisation been involved in activities aimed at creating community cohesion, uniting people, providing space for discussion in a post-Brexit context? Any views on that? Are there any specific things that your organisations have been involved in, things that you have had pressure to do, or things that you think are a good thing to do? Is there anything that's particularly important about the role of community organisations in this time that you've experienced? Just giving people a chance to type, if they want to type. And I think one of the things that we've had as an initial view from members is that kind of community cohesion and getting a sense of people talking to each other in a neighbourhood, and that the convening or facilitating function of a community anchor organisation has really come to the fore in this kind of climate. In the immediate kind of days and weeks after, people reported that there were greater attendances at community events. People really wanted just to come together and talk about what this meant, particularly interest from people who come from EU countries with some uncertainty about their status in terms of future immigration. So I think that's come through quite strongly. And then we asked the third question, what do you think our priorities should be as a sector in influencing the government and shaping the country? And this is really, I think, what we're really interested to get any of your views on. So any initial views that people have, it'd be really great to hear them. And if you want to kind of give it a bit more thought and give us some more detailed suggestions, then using the survey link that we are going to circulate will be a really good way of doing that. We are collecting people's views at the moment, and the idea is that we'll collate the information that we've got from individual conversations, events like this, and our survey, and we'll pull them together and present them back to a session at our annual convention. So hopefully many of you are coming along to our annual convention in York on the 8th and 9th of November. Bit of a plug, if you haven't got your ticket, still tickets on sale. It's a really good event, and we've got one quite large session in the main chamber to talk about the consequences of Brexit and to help us determine our priorities going forward. Our idea is that we're going to create some kind of policy document, manifesto, whatever we call it, on the back of those consultations and conversations we have with members to try and determine what kind of things we want to push for as opportunities post-Brexit. So it's a great opportunity to come along to convention if you haven't. There's details on the website, the Locality website, if you want to have a look. One specific comment has just come through saying access to future funding will inevitably see a change in emphasis on performance outcomes. Will there need to be a review of how community gains may be measured, interpreted in the future? Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think future funding, it's going to be interesting to see how replicable new funding to support communities and areas of disadvantage is going to be set up. It's interesting, over the last 6 or 7 years, there hasn't really been substantial central government investment in regeneration activities in the same way that we saw in the government's one before last. And it'll be interesting to see how the kind of monitoring arrangements are brought into that. The way in which large-scale kind of economic development funds are being used at the moment that come through via the local economic partnerships are entirely absent in terms of community enterprise and community gains. It's all focused on quite high-end, I guess, economic growth. So that's one of the things we'll need to keep an eye on and make sure we're inputting in. So any ideas that people have around that would be great to receive. So any thoughts about what does a good result look like for us in terms of what we want to get out of the changes associated or as a consequence of the Brexit vote? So are there any things that people just want to share that is a top priority for us as a sector, as an organisation, as a network, that we really, really want to push over the next few months and over the next couple of years? If there's one big thing that you think we should really focus on. So the certainty to access to funding, I think that's really come through. I mean, I think it's what's you're kind of having a think about that. It's certainly the funding is really important. That's going to be one of the most specific things that lots of members have said is going to be a big impact for us, and it's a thing that we need to push. The conversations that we've been having internally are that it's not just about lobbying to, I guess, in quotes, retain the current EU funding streams in the same way. You know, certainly having that much money still being spent in the UK would be a kind of minimum standard, but we actually think there should be more being spent. But there are questions about how efficient some of that EU structural funding has been. What we need to do is to make sure there's an opportunity to feed in how money can best be spent to support community-led regeneration, and some of those EU fundings aren't necessarily doing that in the best way at the moment. So our stance is not really asking to kind of retain everything and to keep it preserved, but it's to see a new wave of support for disadvantaged areas, and that's certainly one of the things that we're going to be prioritising. There's a lot around community cohesion and people feeling as if they've got more control. A lot of that links to the things that Locality has been saying for a long time around making sure there are opportunities for community organisations to take over local assets, to run services, to have a stronger voice in terms of how services are designed, delivered. The devolution agenda at the moment is very, very focused at cities. It's very focused at sub-regional structures, and it isn't focused at all on neighbourhoods and communities. And if we're going to use the rhetoric of communities being more in control in relation to the devolution agenda, then I really think we need to see more powers focused at that community and neighbourhood level. And Locality is going to be saying more about this across two areas. We're going to be producing a new report launched at our annual convention on the future of assets, so talking about how community assets, how the agenda has developed over the last few years, the kind of the impact that we've seen and what we want to see in the future. So kind of a big report being published then. And we're also along at the same time going to be announcing the creation of a new localism commission. So talking about the gains that have been made over the last few years around localism, around giving community rights, what's worked, what hasn't worked so well, what needs to happen to link the agenda to this devolution agenda, so we can actually secure real improvements for local communities. So they're two things to watch out for. But again, really happy to hear from you about your ideas, examples, and case studies. So I think that's all we wanted to really cover. Very happy to take any other questions that you have or anything else, or any other comments that you want to share. Any final comments? Just give people time to type. No. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining this webinar. Hopefully it's been of interest. Do let us know any feedback that you have. I really encourage you to take part in the survey just to give us some more detailed information that you may have, and your views and opinions. And if you can make it to our convention, then it would be great to see you there. So thank you very much.